Hi everyone, hope you're safe, hope you're well. Wherever you've shut yourselves in, do stay safe, do keep your distance. While the university workshops are shut for the COVID-19 outbreak, I thought I'd take a bit of time every now and again to produce a video on the materials and processes that we get asked about fairly frequently. So for most of these videos, I'll focus on one particular technique or one particular material. For this first video, I'm just going to give a bit of an overview on moulding and casting processes. And I hope you'll bear with me. Obviously, we're working with very low-tech equipment here in a setup in my studio at home, but I hope it will be useful nevertheless. So really, moulding and casting falls into two camps. You've got flexible moulding and casting materials and rigid moulding and casting materials. The deciding factor for which you would use depends very much on the scale of production that you're going for and the outcome that you want. So if what you're wanting is a solid form, there you go, here's a solid resin cast piece. If you're going for that, what you're going to want is a flexible mould. So that you can pull it out of all of these nooks and crannies. If this was going into a rigid mould, either you'd have to make sure that you had no undercuts and completely flush sides, or this would lock into the mould. So things like these hands here with the jars, you wouldn't be able to do. If you have a look at some stuff that's injection moulded, that has been put into a milled steel or milled aluminium mould, and then plastic's been forcibly injected into it, you'll see the mould line around the outside follows a path, and if you go along that path, you'll see everything is smooth along that side. And that's quite an involved process, and it's very difficult to do if you're not milling, if you're not mechanically processing those moulds. So to do it on a handmade mould is quite difficult, so you're better off going with a flexible mould. If on the other hand you've got a flexible item like perhaps a watch strap or a sports bottle top that needs to be flexible so that you can pull the top up, you're much better off going for a hard rigid mould and then taking a flexible casting from that. And rigid moulds we can work, we can mill them out of chemi wood, we can mill them out of gelaton, various other types of wood, and use the flexible materials into those. Also, you can work from plaster moulds. Really, the thing that I want to focus on is the flexible moulds for rigid casting, because there are a few more options in those respects. The material that you pick will be based on the production run that you want. If you're doing a run of 4 or 5 of these, or if you're doing one just as a finished example, you're probably not going to want to go to a lot of expense to make sure that the mould is reusable. A one-off mould which you have to tear to get into it, but is going to produce the detail that you want, is probably sufficient. But it's always worth, if you're making a polished example, it's always worth trying to make sure that either you can preserve the original or that you can get multiple pulls out of a mould. If you have to destroy the original, for example, if you've created the original in clay, or if you've created the original in wax or something where when you start taking the mould apart, the original is going to be destroyed, you really want to make sure that the mould is going to be preserved, and you want to spend the time and the effort setting up the mould to make sure that you get as good a thing as you can from the start. So the most common flexible moulding material that we use is silicon. Here you go. This is a silicon mould for some door frames and some tile features. So little architectural features like these tiles. These were done actually laser engraved one, and then took a mould from that to replicate all the way across, because the engraving itself took a really long time. So you don't want to do that more times than you need when you can take a cast and then take another mold from that cast and keep going, and suddenly your output is much higher. So that's what that mold's from, and this is RTV silicon. If you look for it, it'll be listed as RTV silicon. That stands for room temperature vulcanization. Not all silicons are able to vulcanize at room temperature. That means sort of cure and end up in a state where you can pull a casting from it without too much danger. Some silicons require going into a vulcanizer. Here's an example. This is a vulcanized silicon mold. There you go. This is for spin casting metal into. So this is a vulcanized silicon mold, but working at home, working with the resources that we've got, you want to be working with room temperature vulcanization, and it comes in two forms. You've got platinum silicons and tin cure silicons. They're also known as addition cure and condensation cure silicons. So a tin cure silicon is a condensation cure silicon, and a platinum cure silicon is an addition cure, and you can think of that because platinum is more expensive than tin, so it's adding to the value by using platinum, so it's an addition cure. The chemical science behind it is different, we don't need to go into that, but those are your two forms of silicon. Tin cure silicons, this is a tin cure silicon, are best used for mold making. You don't want to be making finished items out of tin cure silicons because they generally come coloured, so it's difficult to add your own pigments and your own colours to them. They're also not food safe and they're not skin safe. So if you are creating a container for food, or you are creating a watch strap or something that had to go around someone's skin, you don't want to be using tin cure stuff. It'll irritate the skin. You want to be using platinum cure stuff for that. Addition cure, platinum cure silicons. They're more expensive, but they tend to come clear, so that you can add a pigment to them. You can colour them however you like. They tend to be less flexible. For all silicons, you can buy them in different Shore strengths, and the Shore scale basically gives you how much stretch, how much flexibility, how soft the silicon is. You'll also get tensile strength, which is to do with the tearability of them. So some silicons will have a very low Shore scale rating, meaning they're very soft, but they'll have a high tear ratio. And you'll find that mainly in platinum silicons. There are platinum silicons that are designed for use in sort of puppetry and animatronics, where you want a very soft skin so that it flexes and looks like skin, but you don't want it to tear because it's having to move with the mechanism. So yeah, you'll pick those up. For things like watch straps, you'll want a higher Shore because you want it to be able to hold its shape while it's wrapped around something. So there's quite a lot of difference within the various types of silicon, and I recommend having a look at the various types when you're working on something where you want to do some silicon casting. There are some good companies. Smooth On produce a huge range of different silicons, and their representative in the UK is Bentley Chemicals. They have a very good hotline. If you call them up and ask for recommendations, they will send you samples and they'll talk you through the various processes. They also have a really good magazine on the different ways that they've used, or other companies have used, their products. In terms of the tin cure, you've got much less range of stuff because generally it's used for creating very similar types of molds. This is a very simple open one-part mold, but you can do silicons in multiple parts. Setting up a multi-part mold takes a bit longer. You need to plan very carefully what order you're going to take your mold in, where you're going to put the mold lines, where you're going to join your mold, where you're going to pour into, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail when we look at taking silicon molds a bit later on. So that's silicon. The downside to silicon is that it's fairly expensive. You're looking at about 65 to 70 pounds for a 5 kilogram drum, which will be more than ample. This will take probably 400 or 500 grams of silicon will do that. But if you're doing something much bigger, you might want to look at a different way of molding it, or if you want to do if you're just doing one pull of it, you may not want to do a silicon mold and go to the expense and hassle of buying some. So there are some other alternatives. This is not necessarily a cheaper alternative. This is polyurethane rubber from Zencast. I have very limited experience working with this, so we are going to work with this later on, but I not sure. I'm just holding it up as an option for you. I don't think it would be a better option than the silicon for mold making. I don't think it'll be particularly cheaper. I think this is probably better off saved as a product, as a casting product rather than a mold making product. Alginate there is another option for you. This is life casting alginate, which means that it's skin safe. So if you're using this, you can use this to take facial life casts, body casts, which you wouldn't want to do with the tin pure silicon because it's not skin safe. You can do with a platinum pure silicon, but it's a bit more expensive. Pluses of alginate, it's pretty cheap, it's pretty easy to mix up. You mix it up very much like plaster. Smells quite nice. It's basically seaweed. If you are using it on your face, it's very good for cleansing your skin, giving you a nice nice face pack there. It's quite quick to use. The silicon, you generally want to leave it for 18 to 24 hours to go off properly. The alginate, 10 minutes and it'll be done, but it rips very, very easily. So you're not going to get more than a couple of casts out of it. It's also got quite a high water content, so some things that react to water in a mold, not a good idea to be using alginate with those. And the other problem with alginate is, well, it's a problem, but it's also a benefit. As it dries out, after you've had it molded for a while, it shrinks, the mold shrinks down. So if you have taken, let's say, a life cast, but it could be a cast of a model that you've made, the sooner you can take a casting from it, the better, because the longer you leave it, the more the mold is losing moisture, it's shrinking, and you'll get an inaccurate, warped cast. Now you can use that to good effect, because to a degree, if you want to reduce the size of something that you've made, you can make it large, you can take an alginate mold of it, you can let it shrink down until it's just on the brink of losing its proportions, losing its ratio. Take a cast from it there, take another alginate mold, let that shrink down, and you're slowly reducing the size of the piece. It's not an exact size, it's better to start off at the scale that you want it at, but you can do it like that. But it's very cheap, it's very easy to make, it's not particularly messy, so that is a good solution. Another solution which I'm going to look into getting for the university when we get back up and running is a tank for hot melt vinyl. Now, hot melt vinyl has similar properties to silicon. It's not as flexible, you can't pull it and stretch it around as much, so it doesn't always release molds as well as it could, but it's one of its major benefits is that when you're finished with it, you can chop it up, reheat it, put it back in the tank, pour it again, and so you can just keep reusing the same vinyl. Whereas silicon, once you've used it, you can chop it up and you can use it as a filler in other large molds, but you won't ever get bonding between them, so it won't. It's only really useful for filling up big spaces. It's not a particularly reusable material, whereas the hot melt vinyl is. Advantage of silicon is that it biodegrades and it's basically sand, so it's quite an eco-friendly material, but as I say, not particularly reusable. So if you're doing something and you only want a couple of casts, that's a wasted mold. Whereas if you were doing it in the vinyl, doesn't matter how many you want, because we can just chop it up and melt it down again and reuse it. There's another flexible material we can use, which is latex. I don't have any examples of that here to show you, but if you remember ever doing any candle making or taking plaster ornament casts where you had little, like a flexible rubber sock that you would pour the material into, and then you kind of peel it off, that will probably have been latex. Latex comes in various different forms. It's essentially sap from a rubber tree, and you can brush it on, or you can dip a product into it. The disadvantages with latex are that it can take quite a long time to build up a sizable enough skin for it not to rip when you try and pour into it. You don't get a huge degree of flexibility out of it, and if you're allergic to latex, you should go nowhere near it, because it can be quite harmful to people's health. But it's a good sustainable material, and for the right applications, it's quite useful. So we'll take a look at latex a bit later on as well. So that's just a bit of an overview of some of the materials that are available. In the next video, I'll have a look. We'll start off with silicone. We'll do a bit on alginate. We'll do a bit on latex. We'll have a look at these polyurethane rubbers and see how they work. And then we'll look at casting into the various molds